first up, my job is to introduce my presenter today, Mike Warjohn. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So Mike is the Senior Director of Strategy at Port Blakely Companies, where he oversees new business development in several big markets, huge markets for timber products: the Pacific Northwest, the Southeast United States, and New Zealand. These are places where trees grow great. And Port Blakely is a family company. They've been in the Pacific Northwest for 150 years, and Mike comes from a long generation of forestry folks. So when it's a family company, you've got to ask the family a little bit of background. So we got some information from your dad on how Mike got started. So I thought I'd share a couple tidbits with you. So it seems that he would take you to work with him, and and your first job, you said, was to carry the lunches, and that pretty soon that evolved into bringing along tools, whether it was a can of paint to mark trees.
I was a mule.
You were a mule, yes. Dads do that to us sometimes. There was mention of stump blasting, and I hope you expand more upon that as we hear about your background. But your dad said that lovingly you would take on any task as long as it involved getting dirty and getting out there in the field.
That's true.
Yeah, great. So Mike went on to get an economics degree at Willamette University, where your dad said you skipped the job fair because you knew what you were going to do. And then you went on to get an MBA from the University of Washington. And over the last 20 years, you've gotten a lot of experience in all aspects of forestry, from silviculture to harvest planning, marketing, trade, and most recently, carbon. And so today we are going to talk about a little bit about carbon, but first, Mike, can you tell us about how you got started and a little bit more on your background?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for having me. I will say in the genre of hip hop, I have a new favorite doctor, I think. So I was born in a little mill town called McCleary, Washington in 1975, which means I am just barely an emerging voice in forestry, and Hagenstein, by about 3 months. So, I grew up, as you said, following my dad around in the woods and doing all of the jobs that a forester in those days would do. And you had to be kind of a multi-position player in those days because everybody did everything. And so I did a lot of tree planting and a lot of, road engineering and slash burning, which is always fun. And yes, my dad was a big fan of dynamite. I don't know what it was about that. In those days, it was sort of it was kind of an anachronism almost, but he still had a lot of dynamite. He'd mix it up in his backyard, in the stumping powder, and we'd have to drive to the jobs where, we'd have the blasting caps in the front of the truck and the dynamite in the back, because you're never supposed to store the two together. And he blew up stumps, and he blew up, plugged culvert pipes and rock pits, and just about anything. I think he would have pulled a tooth with dynamite if someone would have let him. And so, I'm glad he mentioned that, because I think I'm going to be giving a talk about him in about 4 months, so I'm going to remember that.
I think that's a good idea.
But it was fun. It was, as a kid growing up, I cannot imagine a better situation, honestly. And the thing I really learned is that the people that I worked with and I met, the cast of characters that you encounter in the woods is something no casting director could ever come up with. They're just they are people that like to be by themselves, and if that's your path in life, it's for a reason. And so, but the people are genuine, and hardworking, and above all have a long-term sort of view of the world, right? They think about what the world's going to look like long after they're gone. Because if you're in the tree growing business, it's not like being in the soybean or corn growing business. It's a long-term deal, and everybody in this room knows that, but it helps to say it out loud. And so, that was my upbringing. I think when I went off to high school, or when I went to high school, there was an event that sort of changed my worldview all at once. And I know that because I still remember it as if it happened yesterday. And that was, we were on a science field trip, and we went into the Capitol State Forest, which is just southwest of Olympia. There's about a 120,000 acre forest that the DNR manages. And they manage it for timber production, so it's an active working forest. And I don't even know what the field trip was about. It was a science class, but I remember one of my classmates looked across the valley, and there was a clear cut, a recent harvest unit that you could see across the valley. And she said, "Oh my God, look at that. It looks like that forest has cancer." And I mean, that kind of hit me like a ton of bricks, because I'd never looked at a clear cut as anything other than a place to plant new trees, you know. And the rest of the class sort of chimed in, and it became this discussion about how bad that was, and how, you know, why are they allowed to do that, and how is that possible, and on and on and on. And for me, suddenly I realized that the paradigm that I had grown up in was not shared with many of my classmates. And that was, you know, to say the least, an event that changed the way I think about how I talk about what I do. And at that time, this is another interesting thing. People of my generation, and you know, being the oldest you can possibly be to be sitting on the stage, I'll say the people my generation and younger really don't remember a time when you could log a national forest. You know, the Northwest Forest Plan happened in my recent lifetime, and that debate was just starting to come to a boil when I was in high school. And so, actually, I should be doing this as I go. I'll show you. This is a picture my dad took when I was a kid.
I love the safety gear there.
Yeah, lots of safety gear. I don't remember him taking this picture, but it definitely there was a reason. He was trying to impress somebody. I don't know, but I do know that he still has that saw. So yeah, this is how I started. We get into high school. There's this raging environmental debate going on, and I think that by the time I was a senior, the news coverage, almost nightly, there was some story about protests going on. These guys, Earth First, they were blockading logging roads and throwing tack strips out to pop the tires of the log trucks and driving nails into trees so that, if someone were to come along and try and cut it down, the chain would explode and hurt somebody.
And the police were taking down their stands and trying to leave it.
Yeah, no, for sure, and it was a war. I mean, for all intents and purposes, it was a war. And as I went off to college at Willamette University, about 20 miles down the road here, 30 miles down the road, go Bearcats! I don't know if there's any. My freshman year at Willamette, I was taking an environmental law class, and we loaded up in a van and we drove up to the Opal Creek in the Santiam National Forest and observed a live protest, And I just could not believe how much these two groups of people hated each other. Like really, it was this level of vitriol that I had never witnessed anywhere. And so this keeps going on. By the time I'm a senior, Bill Clinton had signed the Northwest Forest Plan, which, by the way, we had to do. Let's be honest, we were over harvesting the national forest. We were at risk of losing this precious sort of ancient forest that we couldn't replace for 500 more years. So something had to be done. And the environmentalists had found the biggest lever within reach, which was the Endangered Species Act and the spotted owl. But the spotted owl wasn't the issue. It was the fact that we were over harvesting. And it was really kind of clear and present, right? I mean, there were people that would go camping with their families up to these national parks, and then they'd come back the next year and everything would be logged all around them, And how could that go any other way when you really think about it? So I graduated from Willamette with a degree in economics. I leave that school, and there is this family timber company, that I have the option of going to work for, but I'm really starting to wonder if that's the life path that I want to take. As it turns out at the time, the company was also having those thoughts because we weren't sure if the rules that had been imposed on the national forest land, which took 20 million acres of national forest completely off the table and brought the industry to their knees. At that time, we were thinking, do we really want to invest in the Pacific Northwest anymore? Is that a place you can go and grow trees and really be successful? Will those rules extend onto the private land? And we started entering into habitat conservation plans and things like that to sort of protect ourselves for longer term regulatory takes. But the main thing is the media did not understand the difference between sustainable tree farming and logging old growth. And the narrative did not distinguish. Logging was logging, it was all bad. And so that's the world I graduated into.
It sounds like a huge pivotal moment. You must have had a lot of second thoughts. And as it turns out, you ended up taking a path you probably wouldn't have predicted, say 10 years before.
Yeah, that's for sure. So when the going gets tough, the tough go to New Zealand, as it turns out. And so I did end up going to work for the family business, and some of my first experience in forestry was in New Zealand. We looked around the world for a place to grow Douglas fir, because we were a Douglas fir company. Douglas fir has is globally known as a preferred, premier building product, and for a lot of reasons. It's got good strength to weight ratios, and you can build with it. You can build green, not in the environmental sense, but in the dry sense. You can build a house without kiln drying, and the wood remains dimensionally stable. And so Douglas fir was our bag. That's what we wanted to do. And so we looked, and as you probably know, it only grows in a very narrow band of latitude here in the Pacific Northwest. The polar opposite of that happens to be New Zealand. So we went to New Zealand and we set up camp and we looked around, and as it turns out, New Zealand ended up being a really good place to grow Douglas fir and to grow timber in general. And there's kind of three I can group it into sort of three reasons why it really worked out for us. One is, I'll show you this picture. The sheep, the international market for wool had collapsed. And so sheep farming was no longer profitable. At the time, there were something like 50 million sheep in New Zealand and 3 million people. They'll always tell you that they had an order of magnitude more sheep than people. The government had been subsidizing the sheep farmers for a long time, and they finally couldn't afford to do that anymore. And so they pulled the subsidies, and suddenly there was all of this fallow land that used to be sheep stations, and you could buy it really cheap. So there was really cheap land, really high productivity, good soil, excellent climate for growing trees. This is a picture on the left. That's my dad in 1997, standing next to a little pine tree you see right on the ground in front of him. And that's me 20 years later standing in the same spot. Nice. So, and this happens to be radiata pine, which is now about half of what we do in New Zealand is radiata pine. So really high productivity soil, inexpensive to get in. The second thing is the New Zealand government was so pro-forestry. They really saw this as an opportunity to boost their economy, to put people to work. They had issues at the time with erosion and things like that, and they needed stability in the soils, and all of the benefits that we know that responsible forestry brings. They were welcoming that with open arms, and they had a very favorable trade policy, and and so forth, and so we really doubled down on New Zealand. And the third thing, which is the most important for what I want to talk about today, really, is they also were original charter adopters of the Kyoto Protocol. So New Zealand recognized, much like our country should have a long time ago, that we have a problem with climate change, and they were going to do their part to mitigate the effects of the human effects on our climate. And so they signed the Kyoto Protocol, and they saw forestry as a way to really meet their obligation. So they, and it was interesting in the beginning. Everybody wasn't on board. Of course, there's always some discussion, especially when you have a parliament made up of about 9 different parties. You can imagine. But in New Zealand, there was a group that formed the Kyoto Forest Owners Association, and they said, you know what, we're gonna jump on this bandwagon in a big way. And they built what I consider to be now the most developed emissions trading program in the world. And it's been very successful. We, at times, as forest owners, we're on the good side of that equation, right? And so there are years where we'll make as much money selling carbon as we do selling trees. And I think it's been a really good experience, and what we've learned there, this relationship where we're arm in arm with the environmental community solving a problem with the support of the government seems like such a foreign concept. Mm-hmm. It is a foreign concept because it's all the way around the world.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, something else happened in New Zealand around 2010.
That's right.
Let's talk about that big event and how it impacted forestry there.
Yeah, so 2010 was the Canterbury earthquake, and that, boy, I'll tell you, that was a devastating event for the Kiwis. I think that they are still shell-shocked, from what happened, especially in Christchurch. That town was leveled, and it was very, very hard to go back there and see, knowing what a beautiful city that was before, to go back and see how bad it had been wrecked. But the government at the time said we were going to rebuild this. We're going to change the rules about what we're building out of, right? Because obviously the brick and mortar construction is not going to hold up here in the next earthquake, which came very shortly after, by the way. And they really got on board with mass timber, cross-laminated timber, and all the other types of big timber construction. They said, we are a pro-forestry country, we have a forest economy, and there's absolutely no reason in the world why we shouldn't be building everything out of wood. And I don't know if you've been over to the exhibit that's over here in the museum. There's a big mass timber exhibit, which is actually very interesting. But they dumped a bunch of money into the science, and in fact, the post-tensioning technology that we're using now basically globally to build wood structures in earthquake zones was developed at the University of Canterbury. And the Frameworks project downtown will have that, and most of the building at OSU, and basically most of the big mass timber buildings that you encounter are going to have that technology. And for New Zealand, they saw obviously the carbon benefits of that. They saw they have the resource, but really for them it's about energy. And they're an island nation, right? So they have limited resources. And they realized that the amount of energy that it takes to make concrete and steel is enormous. Sometimes I talk to fourth graders. We have a big, I'm going to get back to the fourth graders in a minute, but we have a program where we have an environmental education program where our fourth grade classes come out and go on a tour of the woods. And if we ever have an opportunity to talk about carbon, I'd like to talk about the energy part of it. And if you look at sort of the life cycle analysis, which Edie's going to beat me up on the data here because I'm talking in big general terms, but it takes about the same amount of energy to produce a 16 penny nail as it does to produce a 12-foot 2x4. If energy is your limiting factor, and I believe energy is our limiting factor as we're going forward, you're going to have to build everything out of wood. And I believe that when the history books are finally written, the period of time that we built buildings out of concrete and steel is going to be very short. We can't, the Kiwis have national television advertisements that say, look, we can't keep mining stuff out of the ground to build houses. At some point we have to be able to do it out of what we can sustainably grow on the surface of the earth. It just has to happen. And so that was another thing that sort of, as my worldview began to change and evolve, what was going on here, what I learned in New Zealand, and then coming back here again, that was a pretty formative thing for me.
Okay. So before we go down, I guess this deep dark path of the world is ending, I do want to say that there are some positive things here. We do know, though, that just this week the United Nations issued a report warning that we have a limited amount of time in which we can make some big decisions that will ultimately impact how climate change is impacting us. And a lot of that comes back to carbon and trees, and there is some hope there in that story. And so, Mike, can you just tell us more about where you see the role of carbon and forest, especially here in the Pacific Northwest, in this unique region that we live in?
Yeah, sure. So this is, this is the headline that I would like to see in the Pacific Northwest. This is a New Zealand article about how they're basically saying we want to, if at all possible, build everything out of wood. And it's going to be their key to a low carbon future. This is the article that runs at the same time in the Pacific Northwest. So, I actually like John Talberth, and I agree with a lot of what he says about what's going on in the Pacific Northwest. But the narrative could not be more different, right? And so for me, it's looking at this, coming back here and saying, how is it 25 years after the Northwest Forest Plan was signed that we're still in our separate corners and so divided? How is that possible? What is it that's driving that? And I think a part of it, and probably, this is where we get into the sort of behavioral economics part of it, but we have 18 or so million acres of industrial forest land in Washington and Oregon, and it's all, for the most part, now being managed on what they call economic minimum rotation. So if you're going to do a carbon project, which I've done a couple of them here too, or our company has, I shouldn't say me, us, our team has done a few, and that's the baseline, that's the math you start with. And so if we look at carbon as a math problem, if you can imagine a perfect world where science informs every decision and the politicians are thinking beyond the next election, right? Imagine that was possible, let's just say. Go hang in there with me. We're going to look at carbon as a math problem. You have all of these forests that are being run at economic minimum rotation. So what that means is you plant a tree, you nurture that forest, you thin the forest, and possibly once, and you harvest as soon as you are able to get a reasonable amount of wood products out of that forest. Now here in Western Oregon, if you're on really good growing ground, you can, with the improved silvicultural techniques and planting and site prep and genetics is a big part of it, you can reach economic minimum rotation in 35 years, okay? And that's what you will do if you're driven purely by the net present value of that forest. And that is what the investors in the Pacific Northwest are doing. So if we look at that 35 to 40-year-old forest, it has a very consistent piece size that comes out of there, the logs that come out of there. The quality is good. You can grow a high quality tree in 40 years, and you can get a ton of volume. The sawmills have been reconfigured to manufacture this small log in massive quantities. A sawmill that cuts 500 million feet a year has got to log 100 acres a day of that stuff just to keep going. And the long-term effect has been that there really aren't any big log sawmills left. There's a few around, but not many. And so we are in effect feeling the hangover of the Northwest Forest Plan. When all of that national forest land was taken offline.
That's not true. They lost thousands and thousands of national forest acres.
Yeah, no, I understand that, and I'm going to get to that because I think that's a big part of the solution, frankly. But the small log sawmills are designed to handle that plantation wood. They're not designed to cut old growth anymore, which is an important part of the whole dialogue, I think. And the thing about it is, you know, we do harvest and silviculture planning for long term. We're thinking 40 years down the road, and we look around at what is the sawmilling capacity in the Pacific Northwest when we're deciding how we're going to manage our forest, you know. And the limiting factor on any sawmill is the debarker. So if a log's going to go on the front end of a sawmill, it has to have the bark taken off before it can be made into anything. There hasn't been a debarker sold in the Pacific Northwest that'll handle a log over 32 inches in years, 25 years. So there isn't the sawmilling capacity to handle the big wood anymore. That's not the end of the world. You know, we can make that work. But if we talk about what you're going to do to affect the carbon, okay, we're still thinking about carbon as a math problem. If I asked this group, let's say we wanted 50% more carbon in the industrial forests in Washington and Oregon. We're not talking about public forests, we're just talking about the highly intensively managed plantation forests. If we wanted 50% more carbon, how much longer would you have to grow that tree past that economic minimum rotation? 50% is a lot of carbon. That's a big number. That's a good guess. That's 50% more time, isn't it? And the thing is that, you know, the big polluters are saying, you know, there aren't very many of them that are promising a 50% reduction in their emissions. If we wanted to grow 50% more carbon in above economic minimum rotation, the answer is 9. 9 years. 9 years is all it takes to get 50% additional above ground carbon in that forest.
Until you log it and then you release 85% back.
Well, if you believe John Talbert's math, then there is an argument.
It was you math, actually. It wasn't John Talbot.
You know, I would love to talk to you about this offline, but it is, what I'm talking about is meeting in the middle. And what I'm saying is that if you're willing to do that, if you could somehow build an incentive to get industrial timberland owners to grow that land, that timber 9 more years, and I'm going to get to this person's comment here in a second, 50% more carbon. So why isn't anybody talking about that? Why isn't that part of the dialogue? Washington has an initiative on the ballot right now, Initiative 1631, which is going to, if it passes, it's going to add $1 billion a year to this problem, or a solution, if they can find one. $1 billion in carbon tax revenue. Why aren't timber companies scrambling to say, we'll take a piece of that and grow our forests longer? Why aren't environmentalists saying, here's forestry as a solution? If that train leaves the station with $1 billion and we haven't somehow been involved, isn't that shame on us? And the answer is, because we have this exact dialogue that's happening right now. We've got timber companies in one corner saying, if we even mention the word rotation age, we're sunk. We need 7 billion board feet a year to keep things moving, to keep the lights on. And we can't afford to extend our rotation ages. And the environmental community says, we want a minimum of 100-year commitment on any carbon deal, or it doesn't count. And the reality is, we need a 20-year solution. We need to think about, what do we do for the next 20 years? If we can find a way to incentivize for the life of the current need, use the forest as a way to bridge the gap, right? Until we can figure out green energy, electric cars, LED, everything. If we haven't figured out how to do all that stuff by the year 2040, we're kind of screwed. So how do we do it? What's the path forward, okay? And that's where I think there is a path forward, but it's going to require everybody to put down their weapons and come to the table and have a talk. And that is this. Remember those national forests we were logging like crazy in the 70s and 80s. There's now 1 million acres of 30 to 40-year-old, sometimes 50-year-old timber out there that was logged, planted, and then abandoned. And it's sick. And there's a lot of that ground in western Washington, Oregon especially, that is now carbon neutral because the trees are dying as fast as they're growing. You could go into those forests, if we could all agree on a plan, and do thinning and salvage work, accelerate their development into dispersal habitat for spotted owls and all those types of animals. I use spotted owl as the canary in the cave for the health of the forest overall. If you've got good spotted owl habitat, you've got habitat for everything. And use that volume for 10 years to take the pressure off of the industrial forests and let them grow. Now, it sounds like a Pollyanna solution to the problem, but the fact is that it's real math. The math works. I don't know how politically you make this happen. You know, is it a carbon trading program? Is it and heaven forbid, incentivizing with money an industrial timber company to do something?
That's never worked before.
I know, and so, but the fact of the matter is, biologically, that condition exists. And we have out there, on a silver platter right now, the lowest hanging fruit in the battle against climate change, and we're not even talking about it. So it's about the narrative.
So again, some of our biggest challenges are about communication and the narrative and the people and the politics. We're really great at the math end of it, but there are often some of these other big factors that come into play. And you've given us a lot to talk about in our next break, which is coming up shortly. But I'm sure that some of you are asking, how does the average person play into this? Is there anything that we can do to get this conversation going? Do you have any advice for us?
I do.
Opinions are also something we're good at.
How much time is left? Oh,
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. I'll show you one last picture. So this is a machine that was developed by a Swiss company. I won't make you guess what this does. This is a machine that extracts carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and stores it underground. And it is very, very expensive. And they want to build a lot of these. And what I will say is, on the same fourth grade tours where we talk about the energy that goes into 2x4s, we also talk about what is a tree really. A tree is, I will answer. What is a tree? What is a tree really? A tree is air. If you plant a seed and you walk away, in 50 years you come back and remove that whole tree, roots and all, from the ground and shake off the soil, there's the same amount of soil that was there the day you started. All of the carbon, all of the nitrogen, all of the water, everything that's in that giant living organism was sourced from the atmosphere. Just like that. And if I told you that I had invented that technology, if I told you a tree is just a giant machine that takes atmospheric carbon and turns it into building products, you'd give me a Nobel Prize. Because the whole thing's powered by the sun. And if we start talking about forest as opportunities for carbon, and that requires a really even-handed conversation where everybody comes to the table thinking, let's talk about the next 20 years, what are we going to do? I think there's a lot of options, but it's all about the conversation. It's all about the narrative. That's what we have to change.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank
and
you.
I encourage everyone.
Yeah.